Before we dive into today's story, close your eyes for a moment and picture a lonely ranch on the edge of the Wild West, a place where one man worked the land alone, believing love had died with the woman he lost. But everything changed the day his two daughters came riding home with a wounded, beautiful Apache woman who carried danger on her heels and destiny in her eyes. What happened next tested courage, family, and the very meaning of home. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, share, and drop a comment to support the channel. Let's begin this story. The sun was dropping behind the distant plateau when the Maddox ranch sighed under the weight of another long day. Clay Maddox wiped the sweat from his brow as he secured the last fence post, unaware that his world was already shifting miles away. His daughters, Rose and Maggie, had gone out earlier to gather berries near the canyon rim, promising to return before dark. Clay trusted them, but the land never stopped offering danger to the young and the kind. Still, he believed he had taught them enough to keep them safe. What he didn't know was that fate had other plans entirely. Rose had always been the braver of the two, steady and thoughtful, while Maggie was the wild spark, small but fierce enough to follow her sister anywhere. As they walked the narrow trail between cedar bushes, Maggie suddenly grabbed Rose's arm. A cry, sharp and filled with pain, echoed from somewhere below. The sound was not animal, it was human. Rose hesitated only a moment before tugging Maggie forward. Responsibility weighed heavy on her young shoulders. She knew their father would have checked that voice, no matter who it belonged to, and she refused to be any less courageous. They found the woman near a fallen tree at the base of a rocky slope. Her long black hair was tangled with dust and dry leaves, her leg torn open by a gash that still leaked blood. Her breathing was shallow, almost fragile. When Rose knelt beside her, the woman flinched, eyes opening with a mixture of fear and defiance. Maggie, trembling, whispered that maybe they should run home and get their father, but Rose shook her head with quiet resolve. There was no time. The woman's life was slipping away like water through fingers, and they were the only ones who could stop it. Rose spoke softly, telling the stranger they meant no harm. Maggie rushed to fill her little tin bucket with stream water, trying not to cry as she returned. The woman whispered her name, Lohana, each syllable heavy with exhaustion. Rose pressed her hand gently over Lohana's forehead, feeling the fever burning beneath her skin. They couldn't leave her, but getting her home would be nearly impossible. Still, the girls braced under her weight, letting her lean heavily on them, taking slow, agonizing steps toward the distant ranch that waited beyond the rising dusk. At the ranch, Clay was washing the dust off Ranger when he spotted movement on the path. His heart tightened. His girls were late. He started walking toward them, his pace quickening until he finally saw them clearly and his breath caught in his chest. They were supporting an Apache woman, bloodied and limping, their own small bodies straining under the burden. Clay felt a dozen instincts fire at once. Anger, fear, confusion. But above all, concern for the way Rose staggered and Maggie shook with exhaustion. He rushed to them, catching the woman before she fell and lifting her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. Inside the cabin, Clay laid Lohana on the bed that once belonged to his wife. The memories cut deep as he worked. He cleaned the wound with warm water, stitched it with trembling fingers, and tried not to think about the fact that this woman, this stranger, now rested where the love of his life once slept. Rose and Maggie hovered nearby, explaining everything with breathless urgency. Clay listened in heavy silence, torn between pride in their compassion and fear of the danger it could bring. He knew the tension that lived between settlers and tribes. Helping her might bring trouble, but turning her away would bring shame he couldn't live with. Lohana slipped in and out of consciousness over the next 2 days. Rose took charge of cooling her fever with damp cloths, while Maggie sat close, brushing out her long hair with gentle strokes. Clay checked the wound often, noting how her body fought hard to heal itself. He had seen Apache warriors before, proud, resilient, shaped by harsh land and harder history, but there was something different about this woman. She carried a quiet strength, even in pain. And when she finally opened her eyes and whispered her thanks, Clay felt the smallest crack open in the wall he had built around himself. As Lohana healed, she began to speak more clearly. The fragments of her story came slowly, as though each piece carried the weight of sorrow. Her band had been attacked by raiders, men with no allegiance, no honor, only greed. She had been separated from her family, wounded and left to die. Clay listened in silence, jaw tightening with anger. Raiders were a plague on the land, striking wherever they pleased. Helping Lohana meant taking risks, and he had two little girls to protect. But as he looked at the fear and loss flickering in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to send her away. The days turned to weeks. Lohana regained her strength, though she still walked with a slight limp. She helped wherever she could, grinding herbs, weaving baskets, teaching the girls small pieces of her people's wisdom. Maggie adored her, following her around like a shadow. Rose found comfort in her quiet guidance, as though she had discovered something she didn't realize she had been missing. Clay, watching from a distance, struggled with the unfamiliar warmth that stirred in his chest whenever Lohana smiled. He reminded himself repeatedly that she would eventually leave. She had a home, a family, a people. She didn't belong here. But something deeper was happening, and Clay wasn't the only one who noticed. One evening, the air cool and sweet after a light rain, Rose whispered to Maggie that father didn't seem so lonely anymore. Maggie nodded, wide-eyed, saying she had seen him smiling more often, even laughing once, something she couldn't remember happening in months. Their little observations carried truth. Lohana's presence had gently begun to heal wounds Clay thought would never mend. But fate, as always, waited just beyond the horizon, ready to strike without warning. Clay returned late one night from riding the northern ridge. The moon was rising pale and thin, the ranch wrapped in stillness, but something in the air felt wrong, too quiet, too heavy. As he dismounted, Ranger pawed the ground nervously, ears pinned back. Clay grabbed his rifle and scanned the darkness. In the far distance, he spotted faint shadows moving beyond the fence line, silent, steady, creeping closer. His blood chilled. He knew that shape of movement. Raiders had found them. And they weren't coming for cattle, they were coming for Lohana. Clay tightened his grip on the rifle and took a slow breath, knowing one truth with absolute certainty. The night was about to explode, and the woman inside his home was the reason danger now walked straight toward his door. Clay stepped back toward the porch, every muscle tight with warning. The shadows moved with purpose now, silhouettes shifting into clearer shapes as they neared the ranch. He cursed under his breath. He had hoped the raiders would never find Lohana, that her quiet healing on his land would remain unnoticed, but men like them followed blood trails, rumors, and fear, and they had come to finish what they started. Clay tightened his jaw and raised his rifle, the weight of it familiar, grounding. Inside the cabin, Lohana sat up straight, sensing the change in the air. She opened the door, her expression sharp and unflinching as she stepped outside, despite the ache still lingering in her leg. She looked toward the darkness and recognized the men immediately. Her breath caught. These were the same raiders who destroyed her band, the same ones who left her bleeding in the dust. Clay turned his head sharply, whispering for her to go back inside. But Lohana stood her ground. Her people did not hide. And she refused to let the Maddox family suffer because of her past. Raiders rode into view, their horses kicking up dust, their guns glinting faintly under the moon's cold light. Their leader dismounted first, a large man with a scar running from his eye to his chin. He laughed when he saw Clay standing alone. He shouted that the cowboy had something that didn't belong to him. Clay didn't blink. He shouted back that no one on his land would be taken by force. The raider scoffed, asking why a man like Clay would risk everything for an Apache woman. Clay didn't answer. Some truths weren't meant to be yelled across distances. They lived in the heart, silent but immovable. The first shot cracked the night open. Clay dove behind a wagon, firing back with calm precision. Lohana pulled Maggie and Rose inside, instructing them sharply to stay low and stay quiet. The girls clung to her, trembling but trusting her completely. Clay's rifle thundered again, the echo bouncing between the barn and the canyon ridge. But the raiders were many, fanning out to flank the ranch. Lohana grabbed her bow, a weapon Clay had repaired for her days earlier. She slipped out the side door, moving like a shadow toward the shed for better cover. Clay saw her out of the corner of his eye and nearly shouted for her to return. But then he watched her move, silent, steady, deadly, and something in him understood deeply. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for a home she had started to believe in. An arrow sliced through the dark, hitting one raider cleanly in the shoulder. He tumbled from his horse with a howl. Another arrow followed, grazing another raider's leg and sending him sprawling. Clay fired at the third, the bullet striking true. The ranch grounds erupted into chaos, smoke curling through the cold night air. But the raider leader was cunning. As Clay shifted to reload, the leader rushed forward, firing rapidly. Clay fell back behind the wagon, a bullet grazing his forearm. Pain shot up his arm, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself upright. Lohana, seeing him wounded, sprinted toward him, ignoring the danger. She slid behind the wagon beside him, catching her breath. Their eyes met in a moment that felt like the world holding still. Clay whispered fiercely that she should have stayed hidden. She whispered back that she would rather die fighting beside him than be taken again. Together they found a rhythm, Clay firing from the left, Lohana shooting arrows from the right. The raiders, unprepared for such unified resistance, began to falter. One by one they retreated behind rocks and brush, shouting orders in confusion. But the leader wasn't finished. He charged forward alone, fury twisting his features, and aimed straight at Lohana. Clay saw it before she did. He lunged, shoving her aside just as the bullet fired. It grazed Clay's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Lohana's eyes filled with fire. She rose with deadly calm, drew one final arrow, and let it fly. It struck the leader square in the chest, the force dropping him instantly. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. The remaining raiders froze, then scrambled onto their horses and rode off into the dark, leaving their fallen behind. Lohana rushed to Clay, hands trembling as she pressed them against his wound. His breathing came in shallow bursts, but he managed a small smile, telling her he'd had worse. Rose and Maggie ran out, tears streaming, throwing their arms around him. Lohana held him until the pain eased, her forehead resting lightly against his. For the first time in years, Clay felt something warm break through the cold that had lived inside him. The next morning, the sun rose over a ranch forever changed. Clay's wound was painful but far from deadly. Lohana cleaned it carefully, her hands gentle, her eyes soft with unspoken fear. The girls moved quietly, watching the two adults with new understanding. Something had shifted in the night, something delicate but powerful. Clay found himself studying Lohana more closely, the strength in her movements, the kindness in her silence, the courage in her presence. She had risked her life for his family, and in doing so, had tied herself to them in ways none of them had expected. Days passed as life settled back into its steady rhythm, but the ranch felt different now, warmer, fuller. Lohana mended clothes, taught the girls how to track animals using marks in the soil, and braided their hair with small charms made of carved wood. Clay watched her with a heart that no longer felt hollow. Lohana saw the way he softened toward her, the way he lingered near her in quiet moments, offering help with chores or sharing a rare smile. She felt something grow too, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the night her family was scattered by violence. One evening, Clay found her standing at the edge of the property, staring toward the distant hills. He asked her softly if she wanted to return to her people. Lohana closed her eyes for a moment and answered that she didn't know if they were still alive. But then she turned to him, her voice steady, and told him she had found something here she never thought she would find again: safety, belonging, and a reason to breathe without fear. Clay swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside him. He stepped closer, telling her that the girls saw her as family now, that he did too. Lohana's eyes shone with something fragile and bright. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his hand. Clay's heart pounded. He closed his hand gently around hers. Neither of them speaking as the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was an understanding, quiet, strong, unbreakable. The Maddox Ranch had once been a place of loss and loneliness. Now it stood as something reborn, a home stitched together by courage, kindness, and unexpected love. And as the night wind whispered across the plains, Clay knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman his daughters brought home had not just changed their lives. She had saved them.